So a formal welcome to everybody then to this first of the Embodying Histories research seminars. My name's Dr. Emily Worthington. I'm a lecturer in historical performance practices at the University of York, which is in the north of England. It's raining and grey here, but lovely. These seminars are an output of my ongoing research project, which is called Behrman's Body: Understanding Embodiment in Historically Informed Performance, that is, music performance. And that project is funded by the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council. So this project is concerned with understanding what we in music commonly call historically informed performance, or HIP. And that involves the incorporation of evidence from historical sources into expert level performance of Western classical music. And the aims of that range from creative inspiration through to more rigorous practice-based historical inquiry. Over the course of doing this research, I've become increasingly aware of the rich potential for cross-disciplinary dialogue with other fields where practice-based and more specifically embodied methods are used in the course of historically oriented research. So these seminars are one of the ways that I'm exploring the potential for dialogue between different disciplines in this area. And another way that that's happening is through what is at the moment an institutionally internal research network for historical practice research at the University of York, where I'm based, which is co-convened with my colleague Ollie Jones. It appears that many of us across the arts and humanities, and perhaps also further afield, are dealing with similar issues and concepts related to historical embodied research, but also the conceptual understanding and the practical support related to this kind of work is manifested very differently in each discipline, and is also developed at different rates. So music has a very long tradition of this, other disciplines it's a newer thing. And I also I'm observing that we are largely tackling these issues in a sort of disciplinary isolation. So the hope is that initiatives such as this, and whatever might come from it, might sow the seeds for further cross-disciplinary collaboration and mutual support in the future. So, to today's speaker, it is my absolute delight to welcome Professor Lauren Mancia from Brooklyn College and City University, New York, to speak today. It was an absolute no-brainer to have her as the first speaker in the series, and I'm delighted she accepted. So Lauren is Professor of History at Brooklyn College and Professor of Medieval Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. She's a scholar of medieval monastic devotion in the 11th and 12th centuries, and the author of several books, including Embodied Epistemology as Rigorous Historical Method, which is her most recent publication in the Cambridge Elements series. And Lauren is also a lecturer at the Met Cloisters, which is a branch of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So the recently published Cambridge Element that Lauren's going to discuss today is something that I feel has broad resonances for anyone who's dealing with the question of why and under what circumstances embodiment should be considered as a rigorous scholarly research method. And I think with that, I'll hand over to Lauren to take us forward into that discussion.
Thank you so much, Emily. And, it is always such an honor when someone you don't know reaches out to you and says that they've read your work. And so I've just been so touched and so filled by the fact that you've reached out to me and that I get to talk to all of you. And this is really very thrilling. So I want to start sharing my screen. And I know that we're from all these different disciplinary areas, and I also know that not all of us are medievalists, and the sort of stakes of what it is that I'm doing are universal, are about the discipline of history, and then also are about the discipline of medieval studies and religious studies. So I'm going to do a little bit of orienting at the top, and then we'll sort of get into the meat of what I'm arguing, which is, I think, transferable between all of our fields. And then I'm going to stop after presenting for about 30 minutes to take any urgent questions. And then I'm going to give us 10 minutes of a practicum to sort of expose you all to what it is that I'm proposing we do. And then after those 10 minutes, we'll have a larger discussion with just a little bit of that sort of taste of embodied vulnerability on our tongues or fresh in our bodies. So, all right. I am Lauren Mancia and I study medieval monasticism in Western Latin-speaking Europe. So I'm interested in this period of the 11th and 12th centuries because, very broadly speaking, it's the time period where we can move from a Christianity where everyone is converting and understanding the basics to a Christianity that can be experimented with in an inventive way, but before the sort of calcification of the institution of the church. So before this idea of what is orthodox and what is not, and certainly then before the Reformation. So I'm interested in the Cenobitic Benedictine Cistercian monastery. And so this means a place where monks have committed themselves to live for the entirety of their lives. They're not outside of the cloister teaching or wandering around and preaching the way that mendicants, Dominicans, Franciscans might be, but they're rather inside of this institution, inside of this circumscribed enclosure. And that enclosure, I think, is a kind of laboratory for invention. And that laboratory for invention is in some ways textual. They're in a scriptorium, they're writing commentaries on the Bible, etc. But it's also incredibly embodied. They're doing liturgical practices, they're inventing rituals, they're thinking about how it is that one can come to know God. And that knowledge is not just textual and rational, it is sort of embodied and extends beyond the sort of ways of knowing that we use in the modern university. So I came to the question of embodiment in part because I was always sort of nipping at questions that never really were satisfyingly answered by traditional methods of scholarship. So I'm interested in the medieval monastery and its devotional practices, and I'm interested in really how monks experienced what it was that we see is on paper in the archive or on parchment in the archive. And my first two books deal with this in two different ways. The very first book is interested in the discipline of the history of emotions, because this seemed to me to be a space where historians were finally saying, okay, so how does power feel? How did medieval people articulate how power felt? How did medieval people articulate how love felt, etc.? And trying to sort of use word study and therefore still textual archival remnants to understand this question of medieval experience. And then in my second book, I tried in a sort of different way to approach it. I said, okay, we know how it's supposed to feel. We know the prescriptions for medieval performance of devotion. What can we learn about from the differential between medieval failed performance and medieval prescribed performance? So in the second book, I'm interested at the struggles, the failures of medieval monks to do the things they're supposed to do, to try to see if in that space I could acquire more knowledge about medieval devotional experience. And in both of these cases where I was like, talking about Latin etymology and talking about manuscript recensions and doing all the things a good historian does, I was still getting pushback from historians who would say, well, how do you really know that? Constantly, even if I went through all of this archival textual evidence, they would say, how do you really know? And they would sort of leave with, you can't know. You can't know how monks felt. So we can't think about that. That's not an interesting historical question to be asking. And I think that historians feel incredibly comfortable talking about the experience of power, the experience of oppression, the experience of proto-colonialism, proto-racism in a medieval monastery for a couple of different reasons. One, because we live in a secular academy where the experience of religion seems actually a little bit more problematic than discussing the experience of power and oppression, right? And two, religious studies historians themselves also think that we need to sort of tap back on talking about religious experience in order to be accepted in that academy. And then three, the other issue is just that historians really continue to be wedded to text. Maybe they will talk about critical theory if you're lucky, right? But they really still think that there's a kind of ontological realism in text in the archive. And so, because I'm in a discipline that is incredibly interested in acquiring the skills that you need to understand empiricism in an 18th century, the post-Enlightenment way, I am not necessarily with a bunch of historians who are interested in pursuing epistemology in a way that is pre-modern, in a way that is akin to what medieval monks, the way that medieval monks understood the world. And so it's this sort of twofold question of can we use our bodies as historians if since the 18th century we've said we can't? And also, can we use our bodies as religious historians where we're trying to explore this pre-modern otherness that modern people often judge as atheists, as people who know better, as people who understand discourses of power in the way that medieval people did not, etc. So this is like the sort of setup that I'm really interested in and that got me into this work. And so, sort of like a historian, I started to think about critiques that historians bring to other historical work in order to set up a method for an embodied epistemology that might resonate or at least consider issues that historians think about. And one of my key starting places was a Cambridge Element that was published in 2020 by Rob Bottas and Mark Smith, two historians of emotion, who have been very important in liaising neuroscientists with historians of emotion. And they have really helped neuroscientists to think about how we do not have universal bodies that transcend historical time, that we do not have universal bodies that, my body is not the same as your body, even though we live in the Western world in 2026, right? They have really been helpful in nuancing the scholarship of psychologists in that way. But they also then in this book turn back to historians and they say, why is it that we as historians think that we can possibly have a position of objectivity? Like we as historians think that the past is dead and over, and that therefore it is in a kind of distant time capsule, and that we, with our perspective, can look at it with clear eyes. And Bodice and Smith say, we can't, we can never do that. We can't understand that we universally all experience things in the same way. Just because I'm a woman doesn't mean I understand medieval women. Just because I'm a monk living in the 21st century doesn't mean that I understand medieval monks, right? But they say we also, as historians, need to constantly build an extra step into our own practices and understand how we are biased as perceivers ourselves. And so, in some ways, with that as a launch, platform launch, I sort of developed this new epistemology, or new rather, for the field of medieval monasticism. So the question that I started with was, how would medieval monks understand performance? How would medieval monks investigate with an embodied epistemology? And the answer was everywhere. This is all medieval monks did. We think about them as textually literate because of the scriptoria and because historians spend a lot of time thinking about textual evidence. But actually, monks spent their whole days thinking about things or experiencing things with their bodies. So you have here on the screen the root of one liturgical procession that was performed over the course of a single ritual, just as a way of emphasizing to us all, right, that they are moving constantly, right? That the texts might make them seem like they're static, but when you put all the texts together, they are constantly moving. And they are doing this because they believe, in the words of this 12th century monk, William of St. Thierry, that what is around them is going to help them to understand their ideals, that they are benefited by the atmosphere that they are in and by arranging themselves in addition to their minds. That's the way that they're going to understand what it is they're trying to understand. And they also simultaneously said that we need to understand constantly that we can never actually reach the world that we're desiring to know. So monks operated in this position of unknowing that is really, I think, counter to the way that historians work in modern history departments, where we think, okay, we can know, there are some facts that we can know. And monks are thinking, even the things we think we do know, we only have a desire for a world that we can't actually reach. And that makes them sound like, critical theorists more than it makes them sound like modern historians. So what are some examples of how monks pursued history through embodiment, right? Okay. This is an amazing manuscript from the monastery of Fécamp in Normandy, where you see monks performing a liturgical drama. And it's a liturgical drama that took place at Easter, where monks dressed up as the women who visited Jesus's empty tomb and then sang and experienced the sort of the resurrection. They walked into the tomb, they realized he wasn't there, etc., and then they sing the liturgy. This is a manuscript that is depicting the chant that they are supposed to be singing. But what's really lovely here is that you don't see an image of the historical moment of the three women visiting the tomb. You instead see an image of monks, and you can see their little tonsures here, right? Dressed as the three women visiting the tomb. And so what's interesting here is that monks over and over again, especially in this period before the 12th century, said, we cannot have knowledge that is textual. We cannot read books to get the answers to what we're looking for. We need to match the disposition of our heart with what is written in the books. We need to embody what's in the written text and experience it more than we have to just read. And this is exactly not what historians do, right? We do not embody the position, the active embodied position, and also the sort of argumentative position often of the people that we're studying. In a way, I feel like this kind of method is more akin to what a postmodern performance artist would do than anything else. And I quote here this artist, Carmelita Tropicana, who argues in a sort of very tongue-in-cheek a grant application that she doesn't know what it is that she's going to find, that the only way that she can know what she's going to find is to do it, and then you find out what the heck it is, a posteriori, a priori, whatever, right? And so that is in some ways what I'm trying to do. How is it that as historians who are accustomed to reading, we can shake our way of knowing up by not reading and hypothesizing, but instead by doing medieval monastic actions? So the problems of the difference between my situation in 2026 and the situation in the 12th century, let's say, right, seem to be really very problematic, right? I am not celibate. I am not a monk. I am not a Christian. There's a lot of problems, right? I am carrying a phone in my pocket, even if I wanted to restage a Palm Sunday procession, right? We would have modern buildings, we would have cars, we would have concrete, etc. There's a lot of circumstantial, superficial issues that seem to be problematic, right? And one of the other things that the medievals are helpful in doing is that they are saying, we know that Jesus isn't present. We know that we're not in Bethlehem circa 33 CE when we reperform the Palm Sunday ritual. But the point is not to be historically accurate, right? Medieval people are constantly using anachronism in their art, dressing Jesus here, for instance, in the robe of a contemporary bishop rather than in the clothes that Jesus would actually have worn, right? And that act of translation is akin to the kind of translation that I see is as fruitful for embodied reperformance by historians. So this is not reenactment in the historical creative anachronism sense, right? This is not an invitation to do research on the kinds of buttons medieval people wore on their clothing or on the exact type of wax that would be on their candles, or so that we get the exact right smell inside of the church. That is the work of other historians, right? But what I am particularly interested in is to embody these historical actions as if we were medieval people, not as medieval people. So we can get the feel of what's happening and that we can actually investigate it from the inside and explore it as a process of liveness rather than as a finished product. So the finished product is in some ways the way that a military historian who is reenacting a battlefield will operate, right? The costumes of a Civil War soldier were this and this and this. So we're going to, from that finished project, recreate the way that the battlefield operated during the Civil War. Here, I am proposing that we take the material that medieval people were in process of making in the 11th and 12th centuries and play through it in order to understand how it evolved and get the feel for the work. Now, this is not excluding doing the rigorous textual analysis and archival work that historians typically do, but this is to be done alongside all of that in order to open that analysis up. So let me give you an example of the kind of reperformance that I talk about in this Cambridge element. I have often created performance scores of medieval rituals for various medieval performances and rituals and for the modern reperformance of them. This might mean that I take from these incredibly rich sources for medieval monasticism that are called customaries, which are essentially descriptions of what monks should do in the monastery. And some of them are liturgical descriptions, turn left at this altar, circumambulate it 3 times, etc., right? But a lot of them are actually descriptions of how it is you should comport yourself as a monk, how it is that you should stand in line, why it is that you should cut carrots before you cut bread, etc., right? And so it is from compiling those descriptions together in a kind of pastiche of a performance score that I have made that I have started doing these reperformances. Now, again, that feels historically inaccurate, right? A lot of these performance scores are not taken from a single monastery. They are not taken from a single recension of a manuscript from a single monastery, etc. But part of what I'm doing in the creation of the performance scores are trying to shake the modern 26 historian awake. And so that requires me to understand who that historian is broadly. So if I invite the 2026 historian to do the rituals that Cluny had only in the 1160s, right? There's a lot of context there that might bewilder the historian or that might make them feel lost in that reperformance. But by cutting together Cluny's customs with Frutuaria's customs and another monastery's customs to create a more a fuller act that will make the invulnerable historian more vulnerable in their body, then I can sort of work towards an awakening of some kind. So, for instance, in the same performance score that I created for a sort of event that I staged, what I called sort of a lecture performance at the Met Cloisters, which is the branch of the Met dedicated to the study of medieval art at the north of Manhattan. I put together sources to create a kind of embodied landscape for people to enter into. And all of these sources were translated from the Latin. All of them are from different monastic customary manuals, but they are labeled and ordered in such a way so that people can walk through the Met cloisters and attempt to experience this art and these buildings as medieval monks from the 12th century would. So there was a card on how to physically be. There was a card asking people to communicate only with monastic sign language and not with their voices or with modern signs. And so this is an example of like a translated primary source text that then would sort of translate itself into the bodies of these scholars. Now, to give an example of the kinds of things that historians then found in doing this exercise, I want to talk a little bit about this particular sign, or not this particular sign, but a different sign, which is to tell a lie. So, the sign for to tell a lie in the text of the monastic customary says, put your finger in your mouth and pull it out. It doesn't say what direction your finger should be. It doesn't say how far you should put your finger in your mouth. It just says, put your finger in your mouth and pull it out. So, this monastic historian, who is a historian of female monasticism of nuns, she said she had 5 minutes where she had to sit with this sign and do the sign and repetitively reperform the sign. And she said that her initial encounter with the text was the encounter with Catholic texts that she often has as a woman, which is this is surveillance, there's policing of behavior, you're not allowed to tell a lie, this is how Catholic guilt is formed, etc. And so she said that initially she used her middle finger and she pulled it out of her mouth. She used her thumb to pull it out of her mouth, right? Sort of making fun and using cynicism initially in the exploration of this sign. But having to be in this embodied practice for 5 minutes, she suddenly started to say, okay, well, what happens if I pull the sign not out of my mouth with this verticality, but instead with this horizontality? And as she did this, she used the education she had as a medievalist to know that this sign is very similar to the way that banderoles are pulled out of the mouths of people in medieval manuscripts as sort of speech bubbles, but also as a way to, in the case of telling a lie, perhaps relieve you of the lie. So perhaps going around and saying, I just told a lie, might not be like, so punish me in the medieval monastery. Instead, it might be, I am telling you that I told a lie because I'm relieving myself of that burden. And maybe it was continuous. Maybe it was like pulling a streamer out of your mouth. So this is the kind of investigation that then yields fruit for the historian, because the historian says, oh, I was biased and I didn't even realize it when I was going into that text and thinking that the tell a lie sign was about policing. And two, you suddenly start to think about the other possible dimensions of that ritual, that it is about relieving and confession and vulnerability in addition to punishment or instead of punishment. We don't know for sure what the answer is, but this is the opening that the embodiment of these processes can give us as historians. So I am going to show you a couple more things about this, and then I'm going to sort of stop and ask for some questions. So I will say that embodying the past, right? I will just re-emphasize that I'm not suggesting that we do this with our students to get them really excited about monks, right? Or to reinvigorate their excitement about medieval art, right? That is not necessarily what I'm advocating for, although that's of course lovely and you should do that. I'm really proposing that scholars do this as part of their research, that scholars spend time thinking about how embodiment changes their perception of the historical period that they study. And they should do that because one, it highlights biases that they themselves have. And two, it combines a lot of learning that they might have that they are not otherwise combining. So, for instance, doing the work with specialists who understand that medieval people had this idea about senses where the visual sense was at the bottom rung of this ladder of senses. In other words, it was the most earthly, it was the least godly. This is the sort of ladder up to God here, right? So that medieval people understood that the visual was not as great as the tactile or the odoriferous or the tasteful, right? The gustatory or the audible, right? So, how do we put that all together when we're a scholar of medieval monasticism? Maybe we say, oh, medieval people did signs with their hands because they could see them and because they could embody them. And then we just like move forward, right? But what does it mean to sort of put that knowledge next to the woman who's pulling things out of her mouth, right? Why does a medieval monk think that they need to do a sign in addition to an oral confession, right? Suddenly we start to further enliven our understanding of the medieval monastic landscape because of the sort of embodiment that we choose to do. The other thing that this does is it starts to problematize or trouble the traditional ways that historians think about the past and their access to it. And this is where the discipline of performance studies is really very helpful. I think that there are lots of people who have studied performance, theater, performance studies people, etc., who debate the nature of performance, right? Is a performance over when it's finished, right? When the monks died in the 12th century, can we no longer access their performances? Or can we, right? How do we make their performances present, and how is it that we come to know what they are? And I think that historians also need to ask those questions. I think historians in Black studies have been asking these questions, right? That the wake of slavery, that the wake of trauma, of history continues to exist, to coexist in the present, and that things awaken it, and reperform it constantly. But why is it that historians of medieval monasticism don't think that that's true? Is it because there's a fundamental break that sort of dates from the Enlightenment, where historians think like we cannot be like monks, right? Or where historians think that we're better than monks or more scientific than monks or whatever, right? What happens to us in the ways that we know in the modern world when we think about time in a pre-modern way, when we think about it as a distension where the past and the present and the future all exist at once. And that's a real provocation, I think, to the discipline of history, who thinks the past is linear and that the time is linear, and it stops and it starts, etc. Um, so these are my sort of big picture top line items for the kind of re-performances that I am proposing to do. I want to stop the share for a second before we sort of engage in this kind of re-performance ourselves and see if you have any like burning questions that you want to answer before you've tried something out and before our bigger conversation at the end, if that makes any sense. No pressure.
So please feel free to use the hands up signal, or put something in the chat, or do a manual hands up if your camera's on. I think I can see everyone at once. I've got you all on one screen. So.
Or I've been incredibly clear. Could be that. Could be that.
Yeah, looks like we don't have any burning questions at this stage. So if
Great.
we go
Let's do
straight
it.
into the practicum, then we can see what that does to us.
Right. So I know that it's dinner time for some of you, but I'm going to do something annoying and I'm going to make you turn on your Zoom cameras in a second. That does not mean you should change what you're wearing or that you're in the middle of playing with children or whatever it is. Okay. One of the hard things about doing this work on Zoom, which I'm sure I don't have to tell any of you, is that the if my vision of scholarship is that we are incredibly passive and distant from our subjects, right? We really like it like that. And Zoom just sort of allows us to be that way even more, right? And you all know this, right? That there's a difference between presence and distance, that there is a difference between the vulnerability that presence requires and distance. And so when I have done these practicums in the past over Zoom and people haven't turned on their cameras, they have not been as productive, I shall say. And so I'm going to invite you to do that if you would, just to see what happens. So you guys are a little test there too. So turn on your Zoom cameras. I'm going to stay here, but I'm going to ask you to stand up in your space and put your computer on the floor so that we see your feet. We're not looking at your feet. Don't worry about it. So don't fix anything on your feet if you're not wearing shoes, if you didn't get a pedicure, if your carpet is dirty, if your dog is licking your toes, it's all good. Fight the urge to fix anything. Come as you are. Amazing. So, and if you want to, tilt your camera all the way down or whatever, just to look at your feet, it's totally fine. If you can't get your camera looking at your feet, that's also fine. It's all good. So I'm going to orient you as you get sort of settled. We're going to do a practicum that is using a performance score from the Middle Ages, from the 13th century, that was written by a mendicant named Saint Dominic. So mendicants are different from medieval monks because they walk. They walk around, and so the feet are a big deal. They walk around and they preach, they walk around and they teach. They believe that their visible, embodied presence of poverty often is really important in new medieval cities because people are starting to wear fur and get wealthier, and they think that the physical example and the physical experience of walking past and neglecting someone who is begging is more important than the textual prescription, you need to give alms to the poor. And so Dominic wants his monks to really be in their bodies. And he thinks that there should be only embodied ways of prayer, prescribed ways of prayer, so that, and this is a quote, the body and soul is humbled down to the dust, so that the soul can cleave to the pavement. And the way that the soul cleaved to the pavement in the Middle Ages was through the feet, if you can believe it. Augustine said that your foot is your love. And he said that in part because your foot was the dirtiest part of you in the Middle Ages, not a lot of paved streets. And also because your feet are what cause you to trip and what cause you to walk in the right direction. So I'm going to start speaking only in medieval words that have been translated. Everything I'm about to say is from a medieval source. So we together are going to penetrate meaning, not through the written text, but with experience leading the way. So return to yourself as if you were coming from far away, as if you were walking on a very, very long journey. So stay sober and alert in your mind, but recollect in your body and fix in your presence. Let the sweetness of what you want, of what you have an intensity of desire for, let that sweetness touch your mind and go into the inner desert and come to the mountain of that object of your intensity desire to do reverence. And remember that it is your feet that are your love. Give yourself up wholly. Throw yourself down flat on the floor so that your heart is with your feet. Your heart will be pricked by the compunction that your feet know so well, so that your soul sticks to the floor. Land on the ground as you have landed, and know the depths of humility so that you may rise. Your heart will be pricked with compunction as your soul, like your feet, stick to the floor. Give yourself up wholly and make yourself alive. Fix your inner gaze on the object of your intensity of desire. Look intently at it and speak in your heart so that your voice is not heard at all. Remain on the floor with your feet while your mind now is caught up in wonder. Outstretch your hands as far as they will go and put them on the floor. Cleave to the pavement to quicken yourself. Down in the dust, your belly cleaves to the earth. Stretch your whole body up towards heaven like an arrow being shot straight up in the air, your hands stretched right above your head, either held together or open as if to receive something. Join your hands, holding them tightly before your eyes and hunching yourself up. Lift your hands to your shoulders and again cleave to the earth. Fix your ears more attentively to your soul as if it is something that is being spoken. You are in a lonely place, so disport yourself with meditation and a state of contemplation and love. You're being led into the wilderness, and you will speak to your heart by kindling a fire. Fix your inner gaze on the object of your intensity of desire. Look intently at it and speak in your heart so that your voice is not heard at all. Throw yourself down flat on the face of the ground so that your heart is pricked with compunction and you are prone. Prone is uncomfortable and demeaning. Face upward only comes when you're dying to face heaven. Give yourself up wholly and make yourself alive. For we penetrate meaning not through written text, but with experience leading the way. Humility expects elevation. So throw yourself down on the ground one last time so your heart is fully pricked with compunction, so that your soul sticks to the floor, so that you cleave to the pavement, so that your soul is humbled down to the dust, so that your belly cleaves to the earth. And now stand and return to yourself as you are. So you can come to a seat now. Okay. So what I want to do first is stay inside of the exercise and see what people felt, found, thought, discovered, did, anything that you want to share. And if you want to share it in the chat, that's cool. But I want to sort of collect all of the things that we found so that we can see how doing that exercise helps us to know something about Dominican prayer posture practice that we would maybe not have known just from looking at the images or reading the texts that I read aloud. Again, acknowledging that we are on Zoom, et cetera, et cetera. So does anyone want to start with like a stumbling articulation of something that this was like, something that this surprised you with, something that disappointed you about it? All observations are cool. And you were allowed to turn off your camera if you would desire to do that. Grateful for the carpet versus a cold monastic floor. Right on. Totally. Um, there's a really fantastic book on the floor in monasteries and in churches. And if you think about, for instance, uh, this is Francis doing Dominican prayer postures, and he's got a little rug, but he also has this tiled floor, which is definitely something that is invented in medieval churches because they are using the floor all the time in this way. It totally felt like yoga. The idea that you have to prepare the body before you meditate is like key. Awesome. Scarily devotional and intense. I like that. I'm interested in what scary means. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting is that people, like if I'm with my students, if I'm with my graduate students, we're talking about medieval texts, right? They might for a second say scarily devotional and intense, and then they'll all laugh, and then they'll retreat into, therefore this was the discourse of power in the monastery, or therefore this is why this disciplinary, they retreat into the sort of secular, less scary structures that they're used to talking about in their classes. Hmm. I mean, being worried that the cat is going to come and disturb you is also really interesting. So, we have this idea about theater in the modern world, right? Where everything is perfect. Think like Broadway show, right? The lights are perfect, the curtain goes up, no one makes a mistake, the show must go on if you make a mistake, etc., right? And I think that that idea plagues our understanding of the performance of activities, right? Like Christmas at my mom's house equals like pageantry that must be perfect. And I think that performance art that is sloppy and messy and filled with mistakes and filled with failure also often is receives the judgment of people who are like, "Ugh," right? But I think that the fear of the cat walking on you is part of that monastic experience. And so often historians look at liturgical documents and think about them as theatrical performance on Broadway and not as filled with failure and mistakes. Yes, Joseph's idea that he was an altar server for many years, right? Like monks and priests today still work within the pre-modern framework of time, and they think they are doing a ritual that is happening everywhere else in the world for with being done by other Christians, and that has historically been done, and that is being done in heaven, and that will be done in the future. So that kind of otherworldliness of this sort of total symbiosis and connection, that's like an idea of how time and history work that is queered, right, for our modern sensibilities, but actually is pre-modern. Oh my God, being in contact with your body when in everyday life you tend to forget that you have a body. This is such a great insight for monasticism, right? Where they're constantly like, this is one of the great misconceptions about the medieval, right? Where we think like they must have thought their body was horrible. They wanted to be celibate, like they wanted to get rid of their body. Their body was the sinful thing. Except the cool thing about monasticism is that they know they have a body and the body is the conduit to God, as Jesus took on a body, etc. And so the resurrection of the body at the end of time is something that happens to everyone. In paradise, you will have your 33-year-old body again. And why? Because they think that the body is essential. It's an essential way of perceiving the world. Jesus chose to have one. And so we need to ignite it and be in contact with it, according to the monks, not according to, my PhD advisor. So, this is something that we have to think about a lot. Davening 100%. Love it. Oh, this is so interesting that it struck me when the attention shifted to the ear and sound in general. Hard to focus on the sound and inner voice at the same time. So cool, right? And that then allows us to think about like, how was this taught? What was the preferred mode for teaching it? And how did monks learn, right? Like how was the body trained in the monastery? Was it trained with verbal instruction? Was it trained with written instruction? Or was it trained just by example? And then did they actually understand what they were doing, or was it just rote? I mean, these are all really interesting questions that can then get at how is authenticity of feeling conditioned? Does the doing make it so or not, right? Weird and exposing is great. Again, something we do not think about, right? The historiography of medieval monasticism, for very good reasons, right, has been spending a lot of time focusing on the oppressive nature of the institution of the church. And we need that historiography. It's necessary, right? Um, but also to think about how, yes, these people were doing these oppressive things, and also much of their day was spent in this necessarily vulnerable state, right? Suddenly we then have two opposite things that help us better understand their psychology, their choices, et cetera, right? So that, the president of the United States is not surrendering and vulnerable in this way necessarily, right? And so our conflation with our modern encounters with authority and with monastic ideas of authority might have to be different. Oh, very cool. Having my heart and head on the same axis, but having my attention drawn to that was very powerful. This is where, like, knowing something about medieval ideas of the body is also helpful, right? There's a very popular metaphor that medieval people use and that then is evident in the frontispieces, for instance, of Hobbes' Leviathan, where the king is the head and then the whole body of society is made up of the bodies of other people. And so peasants are the feet and the hands, and monks are the heart, and that kind of thing. But understanding then the microcosm of authority and leadership structures in the monastery, to have the head and the heart on the same axis then subverts the sort of abbatial power authority thing. And what's interesting about that is that we have vertical community in the monastery and horizontal community, and perhaps that's being embodied here too, right? Someone else had an invigoratingly cold monastic floor. So cool. Mountain of desire for sure, right? All of this stuff is intertextually experienced in the monastic body, but I think it's not just intellectual because they also sing it in the liturgy. These are metaphors that come from psalms, that come from processions, that come from antiphons, that are expressed in an embodied way. And so where it lives and how it lives is going to be different. Um, Absolutely. Embodiment of subservience to the church. Very cool. And also radical to think, I mean, this is why the Francis image I think is so interesting, right? To see the leaders of the church doing it with you next to the children of the church, right? Is also very stunning, perhaps. I talk in the end of my element about going to a monastery and watching monks give each other the Eucharist, and how my experience as a child going and seeing those lines to receive the Eucharist was like a very much a power dynamic. Priest in charge, priest has access to this, I don't have access to it. But at a monastery where everyone is a priest and they take turns doing the Eucharist, giving the Eucharist to each other, and then they each take it and prostrate next to each other. It's like, again, a kind of different horizontality than my modern brain associates with church authority, which is very, very cool. Awesome. Dust. Oh, so cool. Yeah, to think about think about dust metaphors as not just biblical, but also literally on the floor with you is very cool. All right, so these are observations that we could feed back into a larger analysis of the Dominican prayer postures, but I think that the prayer postures are much more enriched for that kind of vulnerable experience. And so I'm happy to talk about other examples of how I've done this work and what the conclusions have been and stuff, but let's open it up to conversation now for half an hour, shall we?
Thank you so much. I'm happy for people to just unmute themselves if it's quiet, or to use the hands up or use the chat. It's nice to have verbal interaction if we can. I know the chat sometimes is feels safer, but
The chats are like annotation at the margin of the medieval manuscript.
yeah, Judith.
Hi, thank you so much. That's such a fascinating talk that you just gave, and the experience, very cool, also very dusty on my end. Um, my question is if you've come across or how you handle other intersectional aspects like gender. Is there such a thing for women's monasteries, nunneries as well? Is there a way of embodying different? How do you deal with that?
Totally, totally. These are great questions. So there are two different directions. There are many directions I could answer this from, but I'll answer two, right? One, that observation that I talked about pulling the lie out of the mouth, came from a woman and a Catholic woman. And I think that her identity was important in identifying a wider bias among modern historians about Catholicism and the perception of Catholicism and surveillance and stuff like that. So I think that on that in that way, gender was important, that her gender was different from the monastic gender of the medieval source. But I also think that I study male monasteries, and so a lot of this, I mean, all the sources that I've been using have been male. I There's some fabulous and fascinating work on female monasteries, and a lot of them are similar in what they do. So one of the projects I have now is a foot washing project. And a famous 12th century abbess says that foot washing is the opposite of theatrical, right? She said it is not drama, it is not role playing, it is actually doing. And so, like, her understanding of how the body and performance works is very akin to how these male monks are talking about it also, right? And her foot washing witch ritual is the same thing as the male foot washing witch ritual. It's just for her nuns instead of the abbots for his monks. But women's bodies are talked about in monastic literature differently from males' bodies, right? They're descendants of Eve, they're corruptible, they menstruate. All of these things change the way that they can experience the church, change the way they can experience the Eucharist, etc. And so we would think about them as, therefore, products of the sort of misogyny that is the discourse of the body in the church. And yet we have so many examples of women ministering to each other, like being Eucharistic ministers and stuff, and defying these precepts when looking at this period of 11th and 12th century monks and nuns, because it's this period of invention. So, like, Catholic Reformation monasteries are not going to have that because they are much more tightly policed in the wake of the Reformation. But this 11th and 12th century period where all this inventing is happening, these convents are using Anglo-Saxon and they shouldn't be, et cetera. Like, they're using the vernacular. So there's a lot of ways in which the gender ideas that we have are incorrect. Even our ideas from male monastic texts might be incorrect in practice. And then the final thing is that because women are thought to be daughters of Eve, they are actually a desired position for men. And people like Carolyn Walker Bynum have written about this a lot, that like the female positionality is actually more, can access humility better because women are so bad, if that makes sense. So lots of men in devotional practice are trying to imagine themselves as women, which is so cool and so unmodern, right? But like that also troubles these gender differentials that our modern minds might want to make. It's a great question. It's a dissertation.
Thank you.
Gillian, please go ahead.
Yes, I just wondered, would lay members of the monastic communities have done the same sort of moving about? Or so
Yeah,
does that, I mean, if the answer is no, then that suggests a sort of different experience of the religious nature
totally.
of it, I suppose.
So I think there's some things that laymen are doing their own thing, right? You know, Ali, I think was his, yes, Ali, who works on York. I assume he works on York drama, being at York, right? But like, one of the amazing things about late medieval drama is that all of these laymen who are doing plays, right, are artisans, they are fundamentally embodied, right? The way that they think about craft and creating, right, is through making and hammering, and God therefore is a craftsman, right? So the way that they think about their body might be slightly different, although monks are also artisans, are also farmers, etc. in this period. But they still think that the body is a conduit to the divine, right? And so in the York plays, right, they might be hammering a ship and pretending that they're Noah, but the way that they're hammering a ship is how they hammer a ship when they are part of the shipbuilding guild, right? And so there's like that anachronistic analogy and translation for what it is that you do is so a part of all the embodied rituals in the Middle Ages. When
But they're lay people outside the monastery. I was thinking more about the lay
the lay
communities within the
brothers.
monastery. So the lay brothers, would they be doing this same sort of thing? Or
Yeah. So there for instance, the foot washing ritual, which I'm working on now, right? There's a moment where the lay brothers' feet are washed by the abbot. That is a different moment from when the monks' feet are washed by the abbot. So there is a class differential. But they're still doing the foot washing. There are these beautiful illuminations of shrines, like reliquary shrines, where lay people are crawling into the shrine to get their body into the shrine, right? Where people are eating relics to ingest the relic, right? So there's certainly a similar understanding that access is part of embodied access is part of ways of knowing, no matter how literate you might be. But it's not one to one because the lay brothers do not do all the offices. They are busy cleaning the, toilets and stuff in the monastery.
yeah, okay, thanks.
I'll jump in with one if no one else is queuing up. I'm particularly, both when I read your work and again now, struck by the difference between the as and the as if in this kind of construct. So the idea of performing as if someone, not as someone, and so you're taking yourself into the performance and
Yeah.
not trying to leave yourself behind. And that is such a fundamental difference, because as a historian or the musicologist or whatever discipline you're in, you're always trying to leave yourself behind in order to be objective.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, I wonder if you could maybe kind of speak a bit more about that.
Yeah, totally. So I think that again, a lot of the sort of theoretical inspiration that I have for a lot of this work comes from performance studies and the critique in performance studies of um, uh, you know, how theater often is trying to be mimetic. So like Stanislavski, et cetera, right? This idea that I am going to assume the entire body of, method acting, I'm going to be, I'm trying to think of the characters in Streetcar Named Desire and I can't, but, like I'm going to take on this theatrical character and you're going to live in this illusion that I am that theatrical character, right? I mean, scholars are very smart. There is no illusion that I am becoming a monk or that we are becoming monks, right? But also just I think scholars of history know that we can never know history, right? We know that there is always a fundamental differential between what the text says and how we can perceive it and what the text meant in the moment, that meaning is lost, right? And so because we have that awareness, we can always only be as if and never be as. But also because I think that if we are as, then we have a sort of stilted, um, unimaginative rigidity to us where we can't actually explore. So the playfulness of that scholar, biting her thumb at the customs first and sort of raising her middle finger at the customs, that I think was necessary for her to get to the vertical peeling out of her mouth, right? And I think that is her, the biting your thumb. And I think that all of us are living in an illusion if we think that we are not motivated to study what we're studying because of something that we are or something that we want as people. Um, And so I think bringing that in is the only way we can like be a fully resonant instrument to explore this thing that we're investigating. And that is like, that's very much like performance studies, performance art versus theater. Marina Abramovich, like the gun is real, right? I say in my book, right? But like in Ibsen, the gun is not real, even though the gun is on the stage or whatever. And that the stakes of that then change. Um,
Yeah,
and
that's so powerful because I mean, at least in the area that I and others of us are working in music, the the subjectivity is either often reduced to we can never know, therefore there's no point in trying,
right.
or we can never know, therefore anything we learn is purely subjective. And
Yes.
actually, the permission to inhabit this between space, which also resonated with what you saw about the monks, the idea that accepting that you can never know, but that the act of trying is essential
Yes.
in order
Yes.
to get somewhere, to get
Yes.
to somewhere you can't otherwise go if you don't try. And that somewhere isn't purely individual and subjective. It has some sort of wider resonance. And being comfortable with that, what to scholars is a very uncomfortable
Yes.
and vague space
Yes.
is
Yes.
what to me is kind of so important, and but also resolves a lot of otherwise what seems otherwise intractable problems
Yes.
with doing
Yes.
any kind of history through practice.
Yes. Yes. And like I think that, the professionalism often gets it right, right? The attempt at objectivity often gets it right. Um, I think that religious studies as a discipline was fundamentally and essentially importantly changed when monks stopped studying medieval monasticism and when lay women who were Jewish started studying it, right? Like that we could see things that the monks couldn't see, and that kind of perspective was invaluable, right? But again, that was a perspective that was our perspective, right? So there is something about my present identity that allows me to see holes in scholarship. And so to ignore that identity and to pretend it's not there is actually ignoring, the thing that makes my scholarly voice mine. And I think that in certain disciplines, right, Indigenous studies, Black studies, queer studies, this kind of speaking from a position is okay. Activist scholars, it's okay. But historians are not supposed to be activist scholars. We're not supposed to be thinkers. We're supposed to be sort of scholars who follow a method with diligency and, and I think that like some of that is really important. If I didn't learn Latin, I wouldn't understand what these words meant in a medieval way. That was important. But I think that there are limits too.
I'd love to also open the discussion to anyone who'd like to share ways with the ways that these kind of bigger ideas might resonate with their work as well, so we can find cross-disciplinary connections and common ground. So please don't think that this question session has to be purely kind of asking questions about Lauren's work. There's definitely space for a more open, more of a comment than a question type comments.
I mean, I also, I have such a superficial understanding of historically informed music performance, right? But I, my mother-in-law is a musician, right? And she is always talking about her interpretation. I mean, she is not performing Mozart on a period accurate flute or whatever, but like she's always talking about how her interpretation is essential. She has to look at the manuscripts and know what his was, etc. But also like his interpretation is lost. And I don't know if that's her particular school of thought, or I'm interested in how Emily's question applies to
Yeah,
that.
I think it is. I think again, it's that in between space of there being something you can never quite get at, but there's a value in trying and recognizing your own relationship to it. And yeah, Gillian, please go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think this is going to go anywhere very, very quickly, but it's for me, I mean, as I understand it, historically informed performance is to a large extent about trying to recover performance style or, using archival information or whatever textual information and the nature of the music itself. Whereas I guess there are some areas that, and what I'm particularly interested in, the whole business about craft practice, where there's absolute continuity since the Middle Ages, but clearly the people who are now doing it are not from that period. So, as I say, I don't think this is going anywhere. But I would
Yeah.
just like to hear what Lauren sort of what her responses to that are about. Do we perhaps we don't need the embodied practice in order to understand what gardeners were doing in the 19th century, because we know we can go out and do it in the garden, although we have to engage with it as saying, well, I've now got a really nice stainless steel trowel and I don't have to use dung on my beds anymore and things like that. So I'd say I don't think it's going anywhere, but I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah. Giovanni, do you want to jump in to this, or you think, yeah, go for it?
Yep, thank you. Yeah, I'm working on a slightly later age. I'm working on late 15th century, which we can still call Middle Ages or Renaissance, whatever you want. But I'm using performance not to and my book is I should add a history of late 15th century monasticism in Florence, especially in auditory history.
Cool.
And in one of my chapters, I use a walk I did in 2022 from a place where a map was drawn, essentially, from where a map was drawn to the main church where I situate the second part of the chapter, which is the church that I study essentially. And for me, this is a work of auditory history, but also the embodiment helps me. Well, I literally walked in 2022 and I had a recorder in my hand and I recorded what I heard, what I think was heard, etc. So my performance is really helpful to channel my personal engagement with the place because Florence, in many ways, is still what it was. And obviously, I claim that this is how people navigated the city on foot, and how the different churches, you can actually understand the ecosystem of Florentine monasticism by seeing how close they are, where they belong. And I have a previous chapter in which I talk about their relationship with each other and with powerful families and so forth. So sometimes embodiment doesn't have, and performance doesn't have this to be the center of the thing, but it can, at least that's the way I'm using it, to inform a narrative and the narrative part of my work, and also to help situate the auditory experience of people, which may or may not be recoverable, but probably not. But at least we can say a few things.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, both Giovanni and Gillian, right, bring up things that make me think that it's not only our perception as the embodied scholar that matters, it's also the reception of what it is we're saying that matters too. So the example that I'm going to use for this is last June. There was this massive recreation of the York Mystery Cycle. I'm bringing this up because I imagine those of you who are at York, know what I'm talking about. But this, 14th century, all day long play festival where artisans would perform Bible stories from the creation to the Last Judgment. And so we did this. So they would do this in the streets of medieval York, and each play would be performed at multiple stations throughout the city and end then sort of at the York Minster, the big cathedral. And in Toronto, we did it at only 3 stations. So we weren't doing it in York. We weren't doing it in proximity to the various churches whose bells would be ringing at various times, et cetera, right? The soundscape was different. There were beeping horns, et cetera, right? But part of what we were doing, we're not only training the actors to be embodied in a way that was medieval, training them in medieval style of drama and not in Stanislavski, right? But also trying to change the way that the audience interacted with the medieval performance, right? Because again, like When we think about theater in a proscenium stage and the audience in darkness and the audience is passive, etc., we then have a different chemistry between actor and audience. Whereas in medieval performance, we had this kind of spectator slash actor, like much more Boal than Stanislavski, right? Where there was, and much more performance art than Stanislavski. It was always sort of interactive, right? And so part of the goal of the embodiment thing is to perform as if pre-modern, and part of it is really to peel off modernity, um, and to peel it off not just as the performer but also as the audience, and then to see what can be seen. So like what happens then when a bird flies through the stage, right? If we are in a theater, we ignore the bird and pretend it's not there. If we're in medieval drama, we don't ignore the bird. The bird is part of everything. And if the audience sees the bird first and they interact with the spectators, what is it that happens, right? That kind of chemistry happened all the time in June. And that was eye-opening for everyone, just in their perception of the Middle Ages, right? Um, and so that in some ways is like also the answer to the craftsmanship question, right? Yes, maybe certain crafts, weaving, right, have been just upgraded with materials, but otherwise have stayed the same. But I think our perception, our interaction with our audience of or two or four or whatever, right, has been fundamentally changed, chiefly by the fact that we all our understanding of performance is visual first, right? Is Zoom, is Netflix, etc., right? It's two-dimensional performance that is staid and not interactive. And theater also is like prioritizing that, at least Broadway shows are, right? And so like how do we rip all of this apart and get into the yoga class instead and understand performance as doing something else than being just entertaining while we passively watch it? Which is another, I know nothing about, uh 19th century music performance and stuff like that. Once, in the salon or whatever, were they all like, woo? I don't know. I don't think so.
Yeah, I think your comment actually about, I've just written it down so that I to reflect on it later, but the idea of, and also yeah, I know Gillian raised as well. I guess for anyone who's not from the background, historically informed performance of music has gone through a lot of different phases and stages of self-definition. Some of which absolutely were very concerned with recreating or recapturing some sort of authentic truth. Others of which are epistemologically and philosophically quite different. So it's a broad church these days.
Yeah.
But I think your comment about it's doing what we're doing. It's as valuable for the layers that you peel off as the things you try to reconstruct.
Yeah.
I think that to me that was a really key, and that solidified something for me in a way that it hadn't before. Is that the act of doing it, and it's exactly what you say about making you aware of your own positionality.
Yeah.
And actually also that speaks to, I think, also what Gillian raised about the idea of crafts and activities and practices which at least appear continuous, although they're subject to continual evolution and sort of differential repetition, maybe, if you want to go into that kind of vocabulary. It's that we have a sense of continuity, but you always have to be also aware of the perhaps intangible and hidden ways that the context will have changed the practice and changed the people doing the practice. It's not, can it feel the same for us as a sort of a post-capitalist individuals to be engaging with a practice than a pre-industrial kind of someone in an entirely different society? But actually the act, and often it's not until you encounter trying to do something in a way that it was done hundreds of years ago that you become aware that there's even a possibility of difference.
Yes.
That and you feel it. You feel it uncomfortable on your skin somehow, and you have to then dig into why does this feel troubling or unfamiliar in a way I didn't expect. And in a very tangible way, that tends to be what happens as well when someone like me goes from playing a 21st century instrument to a 19th or 18th century one. It will appear initially to be familiar, and then it becomes less and less familiar. The more familiar I get with it.
Yes. And that in and of itself is such a monastic philosophy, right? That the more expert they became, the more they wanted to defamiliarize themselves so they would remain warm and not rote to the concepts that they were dealing with. And that's why they would
research mindset.
I mean,
Such a research mindset.
they were a research laboratory. They were an embodied research laboratory, right? And
Yeah.
so, like, Vespers today is not the same as Vespers tomorrow, you know. So it's not only that monks doing Vespers today are not the same as the ones in the 12th century, but it's also those monks day to day, their repetition was also different.
George. Oh, you're still muted, George. There we are.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah. Thank you so much. That's been fascinating, and I've been writing down a great deal. I want to just go back on a different thing briefly to something you said near the start, about these monastic practices happening in an enclosed environment. And I was just thinking about music, because conservatoires are literally called that because they conserve, they keep you safe. Place where Vivaldi taught, for instance. But then the difference is, of course, that they let you out, and you go out and you play in public. Even in a salon, you're still playing in public, you know.
Mhm.
And I don't quite know what to make of that, but either that's a difference with music, or perhaps it isn't a difference, but it just needs a redefinition of what enclosed and public actually mean. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely enclosed and public are contextual, right? I mean, I think my suspicion is that conservatory is a descendant of or is inspired by the university, which is inspired by the monastic enclosure. So that
Yeah.
monastic enclosures, then in the 12th century, Oxford, Cambridge, these universities say, oh, we're going to put a cloister or a quad in the middle of our university because the most educated people are the monks, and that's what we're imitating. And so again, like focus on college, focus on conservatory for 4 years or whatever in a monastic-like environment where you're focused, but then be released, right? So there's a lineage there that is connected to the monastic enclosure. And
There's also there's a direct link as well in various different ways. So Vivaldi's the Pietà is a religious. It's essentially an orphanage, right? And so it's a
Yeah.
specifically religious institution. And you also and the kind of the growth of conservatoires in the 19th century came from various different strands, but some of them were, again, they were religious institutions that became musical training institutions. So there are direct and indirect links, I think, but yeah, you're right. There are absolutely lines of connection there.
mm, mm. But I think, you know, who is the audience for monastic performance is a very interesting question, right? Um, you know, so certainly they are performing in the church, right? That the choir of the church is where the monks will sit, and that there will be lay people in the church listening to their performances or watching their processions through the city or whatever, right? But I'm not certain that they are thinking about performance for a public in the same way that maybe Vivaldi, but certainly 20th century actors are thinking about it, right? And I think that there is a chief audience, which is God, and themselves as creations and therefore part of God. The organism of the community is sort of like sustained by these performances. And that is something, it's like keeping a heart going for the sake of God. Um, so yeah, so I think that you know, God is a patron of the monastery, God is a reason for the monastery, God is the father, like the giver, the creator of the monastery. But all of that is different from an understanding of public in the sense that I think you're talking about.
I
But
think
I'm not, that's fascinating.
I think that does resonate though. Actually, if you think about the emergence again in the same way that you're talking about with theatre, the emergence of a separation between performer and public
Yeah.
is again it's a quite turn of the 20th century thing. Also in music as much as in theatre, and the idea of the performer performing partly for themselves. The performance is directed as much inward as outward, and then whether you're active or passive in that situation, you're participating in it as a spiritual and emotional and a community building activity, which is directed towards kind of the kind of the innigkeit, but also it's to sort of a transcendent sense of what art can do. So it's a kind of church of art.
Yeah.
the violinist Pierre Baillot was described in his obituary exactly as a priest who would perform at a remote venue in the countryside to a silent audience that didn't talk to each other, and who just sort of disappeared afterwards, and treasured the experience in their hearts.
Yeah.
And there's a whole trope in the 19th century of the disappearing artist,
Mm.
the self-sacrifice, the self-negating artist who just isn't there anymore. And
Sure.
Casals played on that brilliantly all his life. There's a famous photograph of Casals with his back to you in a church chapel on his own playing Bach. There's
Yeah.
a famous anecdote about someone looks at the picture and tells someone next to him to be quiet because he's listening to what Casals is playing.
Mm.
It's, of course, frankly, nonsense. But, that trope is there all the
Yeah.
time.
Well, and sort of connected to all of this, I feel like is also the idea of inner and outer, interior and exterior, right? Which I think in monastic sort of emotional parlance is not as bifurcated as we would have today, right? Keep your emotions in, let your emotions be seen. But I think that like the emotionality of music performances, like performing, being very moved versus actually being very moved, like all of that stuff those are modern ideas that in the monastery is complicated. Like, what did the monks look like? Were they crying? Were they stoic? Were they rigid? All that. Those questions are really interesting. And like studying endurance performers and durational performance is helpful in understanding that also, because that's what these monks are doing. Anyway,
Yeah, I
not
suppose
resolved, but
yeah, exactly what you say, that distinction between performing an emotion and actually feeling it is not necessarily a meaningful distinction when you go back again beyond prior to the 20th century, actually.
right.
Or, yeah, in also in historical acting as well as music, as in.
Of
And I was
course.
also struck when you were kind of going back to what you were saying about the enclosed versus the public space. When we use the word performance again, it has this sense of public, but that sense of what you're talking about, the monks performing, and the performance is for themselves. It's an inwardly directed performance in the sense of performing a rite rather than and that's a sense perhaps that we've lost and perhaps could think about trying to recapture in, because if you say as a musician you're performing primarily for yourself, it's treated as very self-indulgent,
Right.
essentially, like
Right.
how dare you
Right.
kind of take up resources to do that, how selfish are you? Whereas the notion that performance is this kind of self-reflective activity, and not just if you're the active performer, perhaps also if you're attending I think it's an important sense to try and recapture when we're talking about this and understanding it.
Yeah, and then also, I mean, connecting to Giovanni's work, right? Medieval folks think a lot about the landscape, how the landscape's carpeting with churches affects the community and the soundscape affects the community. So even if monks are performing for themselves or for God and not for a public, does the sort of ambient noise of their chant or the church bells, etc., do something, a service for the landscape, right? I think that our ideas of like selfish, inner, outer, public, private, communal self, like all of those things are modern concepts that don't work here. And that we can see how they don't work better when we do a lot of the stuff that they did.
Yeah, it's
Or
true. If you
peel
walk
away.
around York on a day when all the church bells are ringing, I mean, they're all within earshot of each other.
Yeah.
And if you had devotional rites going on in those churches all at the same time, it would be the most extraordinary soundscape, actually.
Yes.
Yeah, that hadn't occurred to me. Gosh.
Yeah.
Interesting. We are coming up to the official closing time for this meeting. If anyone has any further questions or comments, I would absolutely love to have them just before we finish, and if not, I will wrap up in some sort of slightly more organised way. Okay, I'm not gonna play chicken with you. So I think first of all, just a huge thanks to Lauren for this incredibly thought-provoking session. and all of her ideas and contributions, and leading us through that extraordinary practicum as well, which was really, it had a real impact on me, and I think on everyone as well. And thank you to everyone else who's contributed to the discussion in the chat and the discussion afterwards. As I said, if you've joined late, just to reiterate, this has been recorded, and the intention is to make it available online afterwards with Lauren's agreement, either in whole or in edited. If you contributed and would like your contribution to be redacted, please let me know within the next 7 days, and I can certainly facilitate that. I will probably be in touch at some point with a short survey to those who attended this as well, to gather some feedback. Anyone who works in this area and knows how these things work knows that these are incredibly valuable, both for me to understand how how to design future events like this, but also for trying to plead for things to get funded. If I can actually give some data on who attended and what they thought of it, that's incredibly valuable. Any other questions or follow-ups from this? Anyone, please feel free to email me directly. I think Lauren has put her contact in the chat as well, very kindly. The next seminar in this series, it's monthly, and the next one will be on Monday, the 16th of February, so it's Monday, not Wednesday, but at the same time, which is 4 o'clock UK time, GMT. That session will be led by Professor Evelyn Tribble, who is a Shakespeare scholar working in the Department of English at the University of Connecticut. Her talk is entitled "The Genius of the System, Cognitive Ecologies, Embodied Practices, and Early Modern Playing." And the abstract is already online on the webpage for these sessions, which I'll post in the chat in a second. And there are further events planned in March and April. So the March one is the historical martial arts specialist Daniel Jacquet. April will be Ben Spatz and Webster MacDonald, who come from a theatre and Black Studies background. And I'm also about to announce a final session in May where I'll present a bit of my work in dialogue with an experimental music specialist, Mira Benjamin from City University in London. So all that remains is for me to thank everyone very much. Give Lauren a big round of applause. Thank you so much again for everything. And I hope to see you at some future sessions as well.
Thank you, everyone.